Welcome to the Future of Supply Chain, presented by Dynamo. Each episode, we sit down with leaders in the industry as we build the future of supply chain together. Let's get into the show. Here's our host, Santosh and Graham.
Hey, ladies and gents, welcome back to the Future of Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Santosh and Graham. Joining me today is Graham Scott, VP of Global Procurement at Jabil. Welcome, Graham. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Santosh. Appreciate you having me on.
So, kind of Jabil brings me back to my memories earlier on in my career when I used to have to pore over the electronics and IT hardware supply chain. And I was a public stock analyst. So I would use that as maybe kind of to assemble a read through on Apple or Dell or whomever was in my coverage universe. So this kind of, I think, addresses a few curiosities of mine. But I'd love kind of just to open up with Graham. Why don't you kind of give the audience here the quick 90 seconds on Jabil? That way we level set their knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. No, I can do that, Santosh. Jabil is a company that was founded in Michigan in 1966 by James and Bill, hence Jabil. You know, we get many questions about where the name came from. We manufacture for 400, roughly, of the largest brands in the world. We like to think of ourselves as a brand behind the brand. So we're a manufacturing solutions provider, supporting those 400 customers across, just about every market you can imagine, from healthcare and automotive in the more regulated side to consumer products, anything AI related, cloud, etc. So, whenever there's electronic components, we tend to play in that space, but we do go beyond that as well. We have some packaging business, we do some healthcare products that have no electronics in it, etc. So, very broad, great range as far as customers, and we're located globally. We're in 100 different locations, 30 countries worldwide, and very global in nature and pretty big in scale. We're about $30 billion.
Amazing. And what's the Graham Scott story? How did you kind of get into the world of procurement, sourcing, electronic supply chain?
Yeah, I studied electrical and electronic engineering back in Scotland, back in the 90s. And to be honest, the engineering side of it just never really captured my imagination. I got an opportunity to move into a buyer type role. And, from there, I joined one of Jabil's competitors back in the kind of late 1990s. I worked there for 7 or 8 years and then joined Jabil in 2004, moved to the US 2007, spent 5 years in Singapore between 2011 and 2016, and then moved back here to Florida around that point. So yeah, I've been in 3 different regions supporting Jabil. Great company to work for, and thoroughly enjoying my time here.
If I had to reckon, you probably get a bit more sunny skies in Florida than you did kind of in Scotland, where you grew up.
Yeah, that might have been one of the motivational factors for sure. Yeah.
And so in your current role as VP of Global Procurement, kind of explain kind of your remit, scope, and purview that you currently lead and manage.
Yeah, so within Jabil, our procurement organization is kind of split in 2 primarily. We have indirect procurement, we have direct procurement. Indirect procurement, obviously, any purchases that support the site and the corporation, holistically. And then, from a direct perspective, we split that in 2, and we have what we call electronics or electrical, which is more PCBA type products, and then anything that goes around those PCBAs, so more on the mechanical side, plastics, metals, etc. So I'm responsible for the electronics piece of that. So really the way that we look at that is anything that is a board, as a PCB, or is on that PCB, is managed by the organization that I've got the pleasure of leading. Within that organization, we have really 5 main areas. We have our global centralized procurement team. That is split in 2. We have a pure procurement organization that supports the 100 locations worldwide. We buy on behalf of the 100 sites, and then we distribute the material to those 100 locations. Within that organization, we also have a centralized quoting team. So any new business quotes go through that organization. And anything that we're doing on a sustaining business, so every 90 days we pulse the market, we get new pricing, updates the lead time. A lot of that data right now is really important. We think about country of origin, getting a refresh on that, making sure that we have the right data. So we do that every 90 days. So that's part of that global centralized procurement org. I then have our global commodity management team. So that's the organization that's basically sitting primarily in Asia, and they are negotiating contracts with suppliers. They're negotiating the pricing every 90 days with the suppliers. And probably, if we think through the last 7 or 8 years, where they probably created more value is in the just the management of supply, making sure that we had material to support the Jabil manufacturing locations and also our customers. So spend a lot of time in front of the suppliers to make sure that Jabil gets its unfair share of material. I also have a supplier relationship management team. So that's 7 director level folks that do nothing but wake up every day and think about how best to, manage a relationship with about 120 core suppliers to Jabil. So we're looking at the markets they serve, the applications, the customers, the technology. We also look at the commercial side of it as well. What's the scale? Where are they investing in technology? Where are they perhaps looking to, move away from certain products and think about it in a more kind of longer term basis, to ensure that as we go forward as a company, we've got true partners that we want to support the business, and also we can create some value for them with our customers. So pretty unique. You don't normally have folks in a kind of traditional EMS type company that do nothing but focus on relationships. But again, we think it's really important to have that. And then finally, I've got a small team of folks that are looking at our investments in technology and making sure that wherever we're either investing or we're perhaps developing in-house, meet the needs and requirements of that broader team that I just walked through. The technology side of things is extremely important when you're dealing with the massive amount of data that we have.
Absolutely. And the one thing I picked up on, and I feel like I have to ask to kick off a deeper conversation, is you have a massive supplier base.
Yeah.
And so the one thing kind of in 2019-ish, we felt as we were speaking to some of the other corporates in our network, was there was almost kind of a thinking as to how do we start to consolidate some of our supplier relationships. Over the years, it's broadened, and COVID clearly showed up and, challenged that thinking. And people say, well, maybe we stay diversified or diversify even more.
Yeah.
And I say all that because how do you kind of think about balancing supplier diversification with consolidation, which I feel like is certainly something in this day and age, especially the news out of Washington of late, might be tested or challenged.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a great point. And, you talk about complexity, supply base and scale of supply base. We're dealing between direct and indirect, close to 40,000 suppliers. It's 36, 37,000. It changes on a daily basis. And to that point, it makes it extremely difficult to come up with a true supplier reduction type strategy. And in many respects, it doesn't make sense. Again, I would go back to the initial comments about the number of customers we have in the markets that we serve. It doesn't always make sense to drive that consolidation. I mean, what we try and do is make sure that we're putting ourselves in front of the right suppliers that are there to support the business requirements that we have and those of our customers. So it's evolving. I don't think you can ever say, I have a target of this, and you aim for that and you hit it, you think you've achieved it, because so much changes on a daily basis. I think it's really important to make sure you're dealing with the right suppliers. You understand the vision and technology that they have, where they're going from a roadmap perspective, and make sure that aligns with your own strategy, because that, to me, is where you start to drive the significant conversations, the dollars, the value, etc. If you can't just look at a number and say, I want to go from 36,000 to 20,000. That sounds great, but is it really meeting the needs of the business?
Yeah. And so kind of when we take this kind of concept around resilience, right? That was felt like a buzzword a few years ago. I don't hear it as much anymore, but there are kind of implications here, and I'd be curious, like, how do you kind of think about resilience while still managing kind of the underlying cost structures, inventory, being sufficiently lean, maybe, kind of through this lens of resilience?
Yeah, I think it's all about making sure, again, that you understand the strategies of the suppliers, your customers, and making sure that you have an inventory strategy that supports those requirements, but also just really understanding the supply base, understanding the nodes that they are managing, because there's going to be some parts where you do require some safety inventory. There's going to be others where you're not. You might have plenty of options. There might be plenty of channel inventory sitting there, and that's something that we watch on a daily basis. We've got an arm around really what's happening both within our own facilities, our own four walls. So we obviously monitor our own inventory levels extremely closely. But we're also looking at what's out there in the channel. We're looking what the manufacturers have within their facilities. We're understanding book-to-bill ratios. We're looking at capacity utilization. We're trying to work out what's going to happen and where we need to place our bets and where we need to, perhaps invest in inventory or maybe think, we're maybe carrying a little too much here. This could start impacting the balance sheet. Let's drop that a little, mostly in conjunction with our customers, because at the end of the day, we're there to meet their needs. And, we don't want to get too skinny, and we certainly don't want to get too heavy on inventory when we don't need to. So it's collaboration, it's working with those suppliers, it's working with your customers. But, to me, from a procurement perspective, the best way to manage that is to understand your suppliers and understand that supply chain. And, everybody talks about investments in people, process, and technology. To me, that's the people piece and the technology piece. You get that right, it's going to help you make better decisions.
Yeah. Well put. And so the audience might be kind of saying is like, Santosh, like, ask the question, right? But it's sufficient to say that we're living in dynamic, or dare I say, very strange times of late. And so I have the privilege of chatting with you here. So I have to ask, like, what's top of mind for a Fortune 500 procurement executive, right? You have to deal with geopolitics, trade policy, if I may, in my words, a ridiculous slate of tariffs that have been unveiled. And equally, we're also kind of in the midst of a new technology wave that also has, implications for your customers and Jabil itself. So you're clearly a busy guy.
Yeah. We talk about planning for the unplanned, right? And we kind of look at it internally, and it is difficult to wrap your arms around everything that's going on in the world today. You're right, the tariff implications and what that's going to mean to business going forward. You can't really control that. You have to be ready to react to it. So I think understanding the data that we have, making sure that it makes sense and we can run simulations on it, we can understand the impact that's caused by any of these tariff changes, that becomes very important. So cleaning house, basically, making sure that our data is in a state that we can actually make some informed decisions with it. So the geopolitical side, we're just going to have to deal with it, but it's not something that we can actually alter, if you know what I mean. We can alter supply base, we can change supply chain, but at the same time, we can't alter policy, and we're going to have to deal with it, and we're going to have to come up with solutions for our customers. So that's how we kind of look at that. The event-based risk stuff as well, that's a daily concern, right? Anything could happen at any point in time. We obviously saw the earthquakes recently that impacted Southeast Asia. That starts to then impact supply chain. So again, it's understanding your supply base, understanding their nodes, how are they impacted by something like that. So again, not necessarily keeping you up at night, but you're having to think about what happens if, and planning for the unplanned. So yeah, there's a ton that keeps me awake. The AI side of things, I don't know that keeps me awake at night, but it's certainly top of mind to your initial point, and it's certainly something that I believe procurement organizations, I don't know that we fully understand how it can complement what we do, but there's definitely a major play there. We've had conversations with a couple of companies. We've actually created a joint venture within Jabil with an AI company. And when I look and hear at some of the things that they're working on, it can completely change how we manage our business within procurement, how we manage our supplier relationships, how we manage our negotiations. It's going to empower our experts to basically comb through data that they would never have been able to do manually. So, using that AI to augment what we're already doing and what we already have, to me, is just super exciting. And I see so many possibilities with it.
Amazing. I'm going to come back and double click on that. But I would like to kind of take a step back, right, from kind of current events and, kind of using your words, like some of the uncontrollable things that are happening to supply chain to just better understand, like, what are the trends that are relevant in electronics manufacturing and what are the impacts they have on kind of procurement globally, right? And I have to imagine, like, a lot of that might be things that you get to see before others, or even kind of actions you take that could kind of set that pace.
Yeah, I think if we go back a couple of decades, there's this whole globalization trend, and we were looking at supply chains that were kind of multi-node across different geographies, and you were coming up with a better cost. And now that's probably less relevant. People are still looking for a low cost component or a low cost PCB solution, whatever it may be. But there's now the added complication of, okay, well, that material's flowing from country A to country B. There's a tariff there. There's then an implication of where that comes from into the US. There's an additional tariff. And oh, by the way, there's a reciprocal tariff on top of that. So that is changing the landscape for sure. I think when we look at what's happening in China in particular, I think the supply chain is kind of morphing into a China for China supply chain. As we sit and we talk to, whether it's passive component manufacturers, semiconductor manufacturers, even the PCB suppliers themselves, they're all looking to have dual supply chains. So you maybe have a China supply chain where the materials all sourced in China, PCBs manufactured in China, or the semiconductors manufactured in China, and that'll be there to support that market. But they also have, and they're looking to build, if they don't already have, an alternative view to that doesn't touch, China in particular. So
Sure.
it's definitely evolving into a kind of more regionalized, I wouldn't say localized, but certainly regionalized strategy.
Yeah. It's interesting you use that word because I was actually going to suggest that. And it was probably about 3 years ago now. We ended up doing probably about a 9-12 month deep dive into kind of at that point, it was a very nascent nearshoring kind of trend. And we actually dubbed it as we see the world with regionalized supply chains.
Right. Okay.
And we actually drew a lot of parallels from the automotive industry and how they've set themselves up relative to the consumer base that they serve. Now, some of those are just practicalities, right? Of like, how do you manufacture and transport some of these items in a cost efficient way? But it might be, to your point, that policies dictating that there are kind of these balkanized supply chains where you have kind of a purpose-built regional China supply chain. There's going to be different than your European and maybe different than your American one. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a ton of logic in there for sure, Santosh. And it is going to evolve, and as legislation changes, as, the markets change. And again, it's dynamic. And, I think if we've learned anything over the last few weeks is that because it happened yesterday, it doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. And, policy could change. There could be a ton of negotiations that are happening behind the scenes that, have a significant impact on what that supply chain is going to look like in a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now. So, it's just about agility. It's about being ready to react.
Yeah. And, you mentioned semiconductors. semiconductor supply chains have been in the news for the better part of probably, not just a year, a couple years now. And so, can you give us a primer on kind of the current configuration of the supply chain, or sometimes I even use the word value chain, and what might be happening to it? How is it being tested? What are the potential adjustments this value chain needs to undergo in order to endure in the future?
Yeah, semiconductor supply chain. To your point, it's been a hot topic for probably the last 3-4 years. In fact, I lost a lot of my hair and got a lot grayer through 2022 and 2023, and we're fighting for our unfair share of material. It was extremely tough. I think what we see though, and I think certainly from a market perspective, the semiconductor market at the moment is probably more depressed than it has been for a while. We're off the back of those extremely tough years of 22 and 23, and I would say that we're going through a bit of an inventory correction cycle at the moment. That being said, I mentioned that inventory earlier being pretty lean. We're looking at capacity utilization being pretty low, book to bills pretty high, or where you'd expect them to be. So semiconductor manufacturers are only manufacturing what they see demand for. And I think a lot of companies are perhaps holding back their demand a little bit. They're not wanting to place additional orders. They think about the effect it had on their balance sheet and perhaps even their P&L over the last couple of years. And, there's a reluctance to provide longer than required lead times. Semiconductor manufacturing, it's, from point A to point Z, when you get that semiconductor from the wafer, you're looking at over 26 weeks. And right now, lead times are as short as 10 and 12 weeks. You then get low inventory levels. You then got relatively high book-to-bill levels. You've got capacity utilization, which is probably below optimal. So it's not going to take much to push us back into that type of constrained market. So that's a big concern that we have within Jabil. We ask our customers to ensure that we get forecast visibility, transparency, help us understand what new products are coming, etc. But that's on the more in the supply and demand side of it. If we look at the investments that are being made in capacity, I think then you've got, probably we're at a point now where the investments that have been made in capacity are there to support probably leading edge technology. You think of the TSMC announcements, the new fabs that Intel are looking at, Micron. That's all there to support high-end technology, high-end nodes, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, 5 nanometer. It's not really there to support the general population of components that, when you look at any PCB, it's stuff full of logic, it's stuff full of analog, it's stuff full of diodes and transistors. And my concern there is that the investments that are being made in those more mature technologies tend not to be happening. Understandably, economies of scale, demand has dropped over time, and companies have got to look after their own profits, and they're walking away from business that no longer makes sense to them, or they're just stopping building that product altogether. So when we look at overall demand for semiconductors, we think about maybe some of the more mature products that are still in the market today, industrial, healthcare, maybe even some automotive, certainly defense and aerospace. The big concern that we have within our organization is, okay, we can see the investments being made in new technology, but where's the capacity for all the stuff that's a little bit more mature? As suppliers are walking away from it, nobody's backfilling it, with the exception of perhaps Chinese suppliers, which then adds an additional complexity back into the supply chain. So, there's a ton of things happening within semiconductors just now. It's hard to keep abreast of everything that's going on. But, for us, the concern would be more in that mature space. I think we see enough investment in the leading edge stuff. But certainly more in the mature side. I think it's probably a more mid to long term concern.
It's so interesting that you kind of present this, right? Because like the headlines are, how do we kind of reshore parts of this industry? and we'll get to that in a moment. But clearly, like the whole advent of GPUs to train AI models is like overtaken people's kind of sense of the semiconductor industry. But sometimes they forget, like even my webcam has probably not a super interesting or cutting edge chip per se, but that is needed. These products kind of go off the line every day. And who's providing that? Who's thinking about that, managing those supply chains?
Yeah.
It can't just be all about the new shiny object. So.
Correct. That's our big concern.
And so kind of when we think about the semiconductor supply chain, right, there's been a lot of talk across both administrations in the US around like the CHIPS Act, for example, and the rhetoric around, hey, like we need to bring this competency back in the US. Now, there have been some companies that have made those investments or at least stated they're going to make those investments. But what like practically needs to happen in order to have some part of the semiconductor supply chain actually have some type of existence in the US or even, let's say, the broader North American continent? Because it's not trivial to do so.
Yeah. There's no question it can be done, right? I mean, there's companies, and in fact, one based out in Dallas that have made significant investments in US fabs. So there's no question the investments can be made, and the fabs can be built. And full credit to the guys in Dallas for doing that, because I think in a year or two, although there's tons of questions from the analysts that look after them about, hey, you're carrying so much inventory, are you continuing with your investment plan? I think it's a great move, and I think when we look at them in the future, they're going to have such a competitive advantage over many of their peers, just because there's not the same level of investment, and they're going to be playing catch up. Especially if these regionalized supply chains that we spoke about become more prevalent, right? I mean, you're going to need people in the US with fabs, and yeah, okay, some of the other guys might be building fabs, your TSMCs, your Intel, Samsung, Micron, but that's not to support all those parts that are in your webcam.
That's right.
So
that's right.
So yeah, I think that what's required is continued investment. There needs to be more than the guys in Dallas. We need some additional investment to support the requirements that the US or maybe even the broader Americas have in the future. Certainly need people. Trained, skilled engineers. That's maybe something that some of the schools might look to help and support with. I think we might need to look at that, but certainly from an appetite to do it, I think if I put on my Jabil hat for a second, we think it's a necessity moving forward.
I want to kind of pull on the thread you said, or you talked about, producer, on kind of AI and the enablement, right? And the leverage it could potentially provide a procurement organization. And for our listeners, I'll kind of remind them, like when you kind of introduced yourself and kind of your responsibilities, like that really demonstrated the breadth of kind of what a professionalized procurement organization really needs and operates practically. But the reason I kind of bring that back in and remind folks is my question is for you, like, where have you been most curious or even surprised as to the ability of AI to provide kind of your team with leverage, right? And that's what technology oftentimes is about. I remind people it's leverage. How can we be better, do more, better quality? And so I'd be curious, it's still early days and everybody's experimenting and trying to wrap their arms around this. But what's kind of stuck out to you as to like these things, going well, seeing some results, maybe not so here? Because frankly, in my position as an investor, everything right now, if you were to talk to an entrepreneur, is sunshine rainbows. And we clearly know that's not the truth.
Yeah, it's when I think about where we see the value already, I mentioned earlier that we pulse the market every 90 days. We send out close to 1 million part numbers to be refreshed every 90 days. We don't have an organization that can look at 1 million part numbers. And, using AI, we are able to kind of uncover what needs addressed and what doesn't. It helps set up our negotiations. We certainly haven't and we have no intention to move to, any kind of AI-led negotiation. It will always be face-to-face. We see so much value in the relationships that we've built with our suppliers over the years. We don't want to hand that over to a bot. Certainly from the data mining perspective, it has been, it's been hugely successful, in helping us set the scene for that negotiation, understand what we need to be looking at, what we need to be focused on, and certainly improved both the efficiency and probably the results of those negotiations. Where we're kind of struggling with it a little bit, we have very rich data, but we also have so much noise from the web. And, we can ask questions on our data and it makes sense, and we can ask questions in the web and it doesn't always make sense. And however, we can't always just rely on our own data. So it's how do we augment the best of what's out there with the best of what we have? And we're kind of struggling with that a little bit. So we need to think about how we kind of pull in that external view, that kind of outside in look, to help us with our our negotiations, for example, or any RFQ activity that we're doing, or any kind of supplier meeting that we're having, just to make sure that we're not just reading from the Jabil hymn book. We get something else feeding into it that helps augment what we have.
I love that. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring us home now, Graham. We've covered a lot of ground here. I appreciate you indulging us. But I like to finish episodes a few different ways. And today I figured we'd do what I call rapid fire. And what rapid fire is I'm going to give you 3 topics, and I just want your kind of immediate 20-second response. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
First and foremost on the list, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
Yeah. I think it's going to happen. As a global company like Jabil, we're fortunate we have those 100 locations around the world. In fact, 30 of them are here in the US. So, we're well positioned, as things change, to be able to support our customers. So I think it is going to happen. I think it's going to become more prevalent in the future. So, it's going to happen.
Next up, NVIDIA's GPU dominance.
Yeah, we play in the AI space pretty heavily. They have technology that's just overwhelmingly superior to anything else that's out there at the moment. I think they'll continue to dominate for a while. Don't know that too much to it.
Hanging out with founders who are ambitious and highly capable. I think at this point, I can very safely say that Jensen is what Steve Jobs used to be.
Yeah.
And absolutely share your sentiment.
Yeah.
I'm going to wrap it up here, bring it home on a bit more of a personal note. It's warming up here in the north. What is your favorite spring activity or warm weather activity?
Yeah, well, I'm from Scotland. I'm a golfer. It's Masters season. So right now, I'm just all about the golf.
I love it. With that, Graham, many thanks here to kind of give us a perspective into your world as a procurement executive in a very dynamic environment that we're all navigating.
Thanks, Santosh.
Thanks for watching. Follow us at dynamo.vc for all the latest episodes. We'll see you next time.